Antipodes, Chapter 19. Incendia put out the tiny flare after they had warmed up as much as they could, and they began to climb the winding staircase once more. The increasingly bitter cold, coupled with the dim light and physical exertion, felt like a heavy weight pressing down on them, making them sluggish and irritable. The staircase itself must have been marvelous when it was new. It wound along the mountainside, occasionally winding inside passageways of what were clearly once exquisitely carved friezes, but had long since worn away to near illegibility. At one point the path led them through an enormous rocky overhang that cast them all into pitch-black darkness. After about an hour of grueling climbing, they climbed over the crest of a small ridge to find that they had reached the castle at last. The building was even more majestic up close. It was in nearly pristine condition. The cold, however, was more biting than ever. The three ponies stared up at it in awe. Incendia was the first to speak. "An actual old-world ruin," she said, her eyes wide. "I never thought I would actually get to see one." This caused Jigsaw to tear his eyes away from the castle to look quizzically at Incendia. "You basically lived in an old-world city. What do you mean, never thought you'd get to see one?" Incendia turned to stare at Jigsaw, then a small smile crossed her face. Jigsaw was relieved to see it. This little bit of lightheartedness was such a refreshing change from the dour and silent walk up the mountainside. Suddenly the cold didn't seem as bitter. "Jigsaw, there wasn't an original building in the whole city, save maybe the tower. You probably know more about the old world than I do." Jigsaw chuckled at this. "I don't know about you, but I'm pretty tired. I think we should camp here tonight and go in when we're all rested." "Oh, I thought you'd never say so," Tiptoe said, falling to the ground in a theatrical faint. They all laughed. Reaching the top of the mountain, seeing the castle spread out above them, seemed to drain their stress away. They were still hungry and exhausted, but the general mood was jovial. With a spark and a wave of heat and light, Incendia conjured the familiar sphere of warmth. Jigsaw noted idly that it bore a resemblance to the fragment of Celestia he had collected. He felt a strange tingling in his forehead. "Why don't you tell me about your home?" Incendia asked. "If we are going to be traveling together, we might as well get to know each other better." Jigsaw and Tiptoe began to tell Incendia about their lives before the adventure. Incendia was an excellent audience. She listened intently when they described the caves and how they had come to be populated. She gasped when they discussed the creature that had attacked them in the water control sphere. And the whole group became paralyzed with laughter when Jigsaw shared the story of the time he had opened the wrong valve and flooded the tribunal chamber. "I was on lavatory duty for a month," Jigsaw choked, his eyes streaming with laughter. "Oh, by the goddesses," Tiptoe said, breathing heavily. "I remember when that happened. It was weeks before the water pressure got back to normal. I didn't know it was you." "If there's one thing that taught me, it was to always make sure the valve I'm opening isn't the alpha valve," Tiptoe completed. They burst out into fresh bouts of uncontrollable hilarity. Incendia looked back and forth, bemusedly between them for a moment before she understood. It wasn't the joke that was making them laugh. It was the relief. She'd been there herself at times, after particularly narrow escapes from rubidium security forces or magical protection. It was the only way to release the tension. She smiled, but she also felt an acute pang of loneliness. She couldn't join in on the laughter. Jigsaw caught Incendia's eye, and slowly his laughter stopped. He was looking at her with a measure of concern. "Incendia, are you feeling all right?" She blinked and refocused on Jigsaw. Yeah, sorry. How are your injuries? Asked Tiptoe. Actually, I feel okay, all things considered, Incendia responded. I think it looks worse than it actually is. My head is what's really hurting. Tiptoe glanced at the enormous dried gash on Incendia's flank. You're a tougher pony than me, she said. Incendia giggled in response. Trust me, getting injured is nothing new to me. Jigsaw raised an eyebrow but didn't retort. Instead, he said, That was a nasty concussion. Do you want me to try to do something for the pain? Incendia shook her head. No, it's all right, really. I don't like ponies fussing over me. I never have. Then would you mind if I took a look at the device on your shoulder? Incendia's eyebrows raised in a look of surprise. Then she said, Okay, but it's broken. I don't know how much you could hope to learn from it. I was up almost the whole night we spent in your bunker reading through your databases. I want to see if I can repair it. Incendia shrugged. Be my guest. The device on her shoulder glowed orange in tandem with her horn. There was a metallic clank noise. Then a deep, low note sounded. Jigsaw was reminded unpleasantly of the sound of attenuation. Then, with an unceremonious, squelching pop, the metallic disc fell out of Incendia's shoulder, leaving a hole about an inch deep. Jigsaw magicked it over to himself and began examining it. Tiptoe, however, was staring at the circular hole in Incendia's shoulder. Does it hurt? She asked, rather timidly. No, not at all, Incendia said. I've had it for so long that having it not be there feels a lot stranger. Conversation was light after that. Jigsaw was too involved in slowly disassembling the device to talk much. Incendia was too tired from her injuries and the hike to engage in much conversation, and fell asleep quickly as a result. The flare seemed to gravitate towards her in her sleep, stopping when it was almost directly above her. Tiptoe wondered idly how she could resist the heat before she too drifted comfortably off to sleep. Jigsaw followed not long afterwards, curled on the ground, the partially disassembled mechanism in between himself and Tiptoe. Far away in his mountain lair, Tantalus paced. Things had not gone according to his plan, not at all. All the two ponies were supposed to do was break the protection around Stallingrad. He had no idea they could actually escape with a fragment of Celestia. He glanced over at the cracked, worn sapphire resting on its pedestal and felt a stabbing pain in his head. The anger seemed to ebb. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe he should let them be brought together. No, he thought. I've worked too hard, for too long to let it come to this. He straightened up and turned away from the pedestal. He had work to do. He walked over to the mouth of the cave and spread his wings to their fullest extent. At their widest, his wings were almost 60 feet across. All along the edge, green flames erupted into life, casting a strange, flickering light on the cave walls. Then something distracted him. A wailing alarm from somewhere deep in the cave caught his attention. He stormed back into the depths, breaking his own protective enchantments as he went, resetting them behind him with hastily blown bursts of fire, which formed into wriggling symbols of angry red flame before they spun apart, forming a shimmering barrier in the air. He reached the spot he was looking for, the blue gem on its stand of honor, Rarity's last gift to him. A whining, hissing, and buzzing was coming from the stone. Golden light shone out of the spiderweb cracks in the surface. Tantalus recoiled in shock and anger. He had enchanted the stone long ago, of course. He knew what it meant. He inflated with anger. How dared they attempt to take what was rightfully his? Those ponies, those disgusting creatures that crawled unbidden on the surface of the world, his world. The fury began welling up inside him once more, but he was too focused to let it take over. Instead, he channeled it. With one mighty breath, he blew out a whirling torrent of green flames. They spun like a tornado, whirling around him, until in an instant he shot off out of the mouth of the cave, little more than a pillar of green fire. When Jigsaw and Tiptoe woke the next day, Incendia was already awake. Her normally coal black body was engulfed in bright orange and red flames, and a thin line of fire extended from where her horn normally was. She was waving it over her head, bringing it down with a sharp crack onto the ground before her, leaving deep gouges and smoldering embers. She was magnificent to behold. She appeared to radiate not only heat, but also a focused intensity, a feeling of strength and power that the other ponies felt they could draw upon. Incendia caught sight of them as she twirled on the spot, and the flames began to recede. Soon her coal-black coat returned, though her mane made it look as if she was still burning. With a slight tinge of unease, Tiptoe noted the last place where the flames receded was her eyes. The black pupils took a long time to re-emerge from the swirling orange, yellow, and red surface her eyes became when she was on fire. "You're up!" she said excitedly. "Finally! I've been up for hours already, practicing." She glanced at the massive door at the foot of the castle. "Are we going in?" Jigsaw looked to Incendia, then to Tiptoe, then up at the castle. He sighed and said, "I suppose so, but don't treat this lightly. Who knows what we'll find in there?" Incendia's smile weakened, but she didn't drop it. "I know I'm not. I'm just itching for some action." Tiptoe raised an eyebrow, incredulously. "It's been 3 days since your home city was destroyed by a dragon, and you're injured. You're itching for action?" Incendia winked at Tiptoe and said, What can I say? I've always been a—" She paused and snickered. "Fiery one?" Tiptoe groaned loudly at this. "I swear by the goddesses themselves, if you start making fire puns, I will smother you in your sleep." Jigsaw, however, was staring disapprovingly between the two. Incendia ignored him and, turning on the spot with an exaggerated flick of her tail, began walking towards the door. Jigsaw started forward, yelling over his shoulder at Tiptoe as he galloped. "I think I should go ahead. We don't want her accidentally tripping any protective enchantments." Tiptoe rolled her eyes and took off, moving quickly to catch up with the two ponies approaching the door. It was massive. Like most things of the old world, it must once have been beautiful. Ancient faded carvings covered the surface, and it was at least twice the size it needed to be functional. Over the doorway, in intricately carved old language script, were words that Jigsaw immediately understood. "Canterlot Castle!" he said with a start. "This is Canterlot!" Tiptoe whipped her head around to Jigsaw and let out a disbelieving, "What?" But Incendia simply stared at him quizzically. "I've never heard of that," she said slowly. "Should I have—" Now it was Jigsaw and Tiptoe's turn to look puzzled. "Well, yes, Canterlot was the seat of power in the old world. It was where the goddesses reigned," Jigsaw said. Then with a furtive glance up at the spires, he added, "It was also where they were said to have met their ends." They all turned their gaze back up at the door. It was much too large for them to move on their own. "Do you want to try magic?" Incendia said, studying the small seam that ran down the center of the door. "I suppose," Jigsaw answered. "Tiptoe, if you could push too, that probably wouldn't hurt." Tiptoe nodded and stepped up to the door, extending her wings wide, and braced herself against it. Incendia and Jigsaw's horns began to glow, and the door was surrounded by a strange, mottled green and orange outline. They each took a step forward, straining against the resistance of the door. "Push!" Incendia grunted through gritted teeth. Beads of sweat were beginning to form on her coat. Tiptoe flapped her wings down once. It kicked up an enormous spray of dirt and rocks, but the door lurched open a fraction of an inch. "Again!" said Incendia. Tiptoe flapped down again, and again, and again, the door moving a little bit more every time, until finally the door had opened wide enough for them to squeeze through. Jigsaw and Incendia put out their horns and panted. Tiptoe turned to face them and said, "That wasn't so bad. We were doing most of the work." Jigsaw said, though not unkindly. "You were fantastic, Tiptoe," Incendia said, smiling, though she was still breathing hard. With a private smile, Tiptoe stepped aside to allow Jigsaw and Incendia to enter before her. She had the hardest time squeezing into the small space in the door. Her wings were pressed so hard into her flank that they left an imprint, but she managed to make it through. What she saw didn't surprise her in the slightest. The inside of the castle was pitch black. The only light was coming from the small crack of the door and Incendia's and Jigsaw's horns. The one thing that did surprise her, however, was the temperature. Inside of the castle was warm. It felt perfectly comfortable, and she was immensely grateful after the cold she had been forced to endure for the last several days. "Is there anything we can do about the darkness?" said Incendia, her horn beginning to brighten. In response, Jigsaw closed his eyes and pointed his horn downwards. At first, Tiptoe couldn't understand what he was doing, but as she watched, he began moving his horn along the ground, over to the wall on the left, and up until it was about level with his head. Then a single brick slid out smoothly out of the wall and clattered to the floor beneath them. A small tangle of wires and other wiring Tiptoe didn't recognize. Then, without warning, a brilliant bright blue flash issued from Jigsaw's horn, temporarily blinding the two other ponies. When Tiptoe had blinked away the bright spots on her retinas, what she saw made her breath catch. A startlingly bright, twinkling aqua blue light was shining out of Jigsaw's horn. It was pulsating gently, but rapidly, and with each pulsation the blue light snaked through the wire and out into the walls, growing brighter in intensity every pulsation. Tiptoe glanced over to Incendia and was amused to see that she was staring at Jigsaw with her jaw slack. Then, with another blinding flash of light and a sound like a dozen pots and pans falling to the ground, the lights that lined the room kicked into life. Jigsaw took a stumbling step backwards, steadied himself, and took a deep breath in and out. He smiled when he saw the looks on Tiptoe's and Incendia's faces. "That felt good." "How in Incendia did you do that?" Incendia said, staring from the tangle of wires to Jigsaw to the lights and back again. "That was some of the most. Not even Gizmo could have done." She sat down on her haunches, staring at Jigsaw in disbelief. Jigsaw shrunk away, obviously embarrassed. "Years of practice," he said sheepishly. "Really, I'm not that good. It's just my special talent. The spell was pretty easy when you know what you have to do. All I had to do was give the system a little jolt and all the wiring and stuff was still there." Incendia didn't look convinced, however. She got up and began trotting down the corridor without another word. Jigsaw and Tiptoe followed close behind. The hallway came to an abrupt end at what appeared to have once been part of a much larger chamber. The walls sloped around them sharply, forming a dome about 20 feet tall that appeared to have been made quickly and carelessly out of concrete. A single, bare, old-world bulb hung above them by a black wire which went straight up into the concrete. Directly ahead, at the opposite side of the dome, there were 3 openings in the concrete, each leading, as far as they could tell, into darkness. "What do we do?" asked Tiptoe. "I think we should split up," said Incendia. Tiptoe giggled nervously and said, "That's not how we do things around here. Right, Jigsaw?" Jigsaw didn't respond, however. He was staring down one of the tunnels. "No, no, Tiptoe, I think she's right," he said finally. "Don't ask me how I know, but I think we're each supposed to go down one of these. Alone. It's the only way we can progress." Tiptoe held her mouth open, aghast, then shook her head violently. "No! We can't split up! How can I protect myself? I don't have your magic!" Jigsaw tried and failed to contain his smile. Tiptoe's fear quickly turned to anger. "What's so funny? Is it Pick on the Pegasus Day again?" she said, her eyes beginning to water. "Because I got enough of that at school." Jigsaw was taken aback by her reaction. He cantered over to her and spoke softly. "No, no, that's not why we're smiling. We're smiling at the fact that you think you're helpless." "What do you mean?" Tiptoe said with a small sniff. "I mean that you managed to escape from a sea serpent while carrying me unconscious on your back without breathing. And that you managed to carry me out of that subway station when you had never flown more than a few dozen feet before. And that you managed to sneak me out of Rebellium's compound. You're not defenseless, Tiptoe. You're probably the most capable pony here." "Tiptoe, you're a fighter. Trust me, I have experience with these things. Don't ever let any pony tell you otherwise," Incendia added with a wink. Tiptoe looked back and forth between the two unicorns, then stared down the dark tunnel. "All right," she said. "I'll go, but how am I going to see?" In response, Incendia's horn flashed orange, and a tiny ball of light appeared and floated over to hover just above Tiptoe's head. "That's one of the first spells I learned how to do. It will follow you around and light your way." Tiptoe smiled. "Thanks, Incendia." Incendia nodded. Jigsaw moved back to the middle tunnel, with Tiptoe on his left and Incendia on his right. He stared down the tunnel for a moment more, then looked to his left and caught Tiptoe's eyes. As sure as he was that this was the right thing to do, he was still nervous. He thought Tiptoe could sense it. He tried to put a lot of unsaid emotions into that gaze. Then he glanced to his right at Incendia. She looked tall, proud, and powerful, but the look in her eyes was unmistakable. She didn't want to split up either. He gathered all his courage and gave her a steady nod. Then he began to make his way into the tunnel.